And what I'm going to do is I'm going to discuss the civilian leaders of Britain who came up with a policy, or the strategy, I should say, of dividing the colonies down the Lake Champlain, Hudson River Corridor to separate New England, which they viewed as the hotbed of the Revolution, from the rest of the colonies that they thought were more sympathetic to the crown. And just to talk about George III, George III was the third Hanoverian king of England. He was the first of the three, George I and George II being the first two Hanover kings, who was completely British. His first language was English. He was pretty much educated in England. Unlike George I and George II, whose first language was German, and they were also the electors of Hanover, which was sort of like the Prince or King of Hanover, German state. They were called electors because they each had a vote to choose the Holy Roman Emperor. George III had no connection at all with Hanover. He'd never been there. Unlike George I and George II that used to spend time in Hanover, summers usually. George III was well educated. He spoke French, English, obviously, Italian, and some German. He was the first king of England to study science. He would have been very happy to converse science with Benjamin Franklin, but not politics. He became king at the age of 22 when his grandfather, George II, woke up this morning feeling as good as a 78-year-old king could feel. And in the morning, assisted by his valet, went into his chamber for his morning constitution, fell off the chair stone dead, probably of a heart attack. As I say, George III will become king at that point. His father, Frederick, the crown prince, Prince of Wales, having died following, he was hit in the chest with a cricket ball or puck, whatever they call it, and I guess hemorrhaged, and he had died a couple of years before. So George III became king. He was, at first, he became king in 1760 during the French and Indian War in the colonies, the 7 Years' War, as it was known elsewhere. George II and his prime minister, William Pitt the Elder, for which Fort Pitt, Pittsburgh is named, pursued total victory with France. Their goal was to totally defeat France, to keep Hanover safe was the goal in Europe, and to deprive France of most of her colonies, which did happen. To do this, Britain had borrowed tremendous sums of money. They were able to do this because they had the limited liability corporations that were chartered by the Crown. The British East India Company is pretty much an example of this. India was completely run by the East India Company. It was not a colony, a crown colony. It was run by this corporation. They had their own private army, private navy. They were in charge of India at the time. France did not have this, and they also had the Bank of England, which enabled them to borrow huge sums of money. France did not have this advantage. They raised money only through taxes to finance the war. The First Estate, which was members of the clergy, Catholic clergy, Roman Catholic. The Second Estate, which was the nobility, and the Third Estate was everybody else. The First and Second Estates did not pay taxes. Everybody else paid the taxes, the Third Estate. So that kind of hampered France in its series of wars with England at the time. But anyway, England had borrowed a huge amount of money. When George III became king, 1760, he wanted to put an end to this war, and the money that was being spent on it, it took him 3 years to do it, but they did. Upon the ending of the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian Wars, Parliament looked to the colonies to help, excuse me, to help pay for their maintenance of British troops in the colony to protect the colonies from mainly the Indians at the time. France no longer being a factor because England had taken Canada, French Canada. So to do this, they looked to tax the colonies. Now this, I'm sure you all know, they passed the Stamp Act, widely unpopular, really annoyed the colonists. They were forced to repeal it, Parliament did. They then passed the Townshend Acts, which were a further tax on the colony, and the Navigation Acts, which had been in force for some years, discouraged manufacturing in the colonies. They wanted the colonies to provide the mother country with raw materials, which were then manufacturing would take place in England, and they would in turn sell the finished goods to the colonies. Among the protests in the colonies was a boycott of English goods. And George III really doesn't fit the description as a tyrant that was the indictment of the Declaration of Independence. He viewed himself as a constitutional monarch. He also viewed himself as the executive who was bound to enforce the laws of Parliament. He was, for a long time, very sympathetic with the colonists. He felt that Parliament was really being a little too high-handed in its treatment of the colonies. However, the Boston Tea Party, and I can't see my notes to give you the date, but anyway, the Boston Tea Party changed his mind completely. After this, where they dumped what today would have been millions of dollars of tea in Boston Harbor, viewed this as a criminal act and felt the colonies had gone too far and they needed to be disciplined. And this was George III. His prime minister was Lord North. Lord North was a jovial, kind of well-liked person, but he was indecisive. He didn't feel that he was qualified to be prime minister. He had asked the king numerous times to relieve him, but the king liked him and kept him on regardless. Again, he had a lot of trouble making decisions. He did not view himself as a prime minister. He simply viewed himself as another one of the king's ministers. Lord North was not an effective leader. Now, Lord George Germain. Lord George Germain probably is somebody not everybody here has heard of. He's not mentioned readily, but he was secretary for the northern colonies of North America. And it was really his job to come up with a strategy. Lord George Germain was a military leader. He had fought in the 7 Years' War. He had been court-martialed following one of the battles for dereliction of duty, but was acquitted. But his enemies in Parliament often threw this up in his face. But he was decisive. He felt that the rebels in the colonies were outlaws and should be punished. He was a hardliner. And it was pretty much Lord George Germain who spread out a map of the colonies and looked at the Hudson River Valley, and he looked at Lake Champlain, Lake George. And it was pretty much his idea to figure out that, well, what we could do, we can divide the colonies, split off New England, which he viewed as the hotbed of the Revolution, from the rest of the other colonies, and then sort of divide and conquer. Now, who were the military leaders that would be carrying this out? England, Britain at the time had 116 generals, and they very carefully vetted them all, and they chose what they thought were the best of the lot. And those were William Howe, Henry Clinton, and John Burgoyne. These were the top people. Of all the generals they had, they figured they were the best. And they were. They probably were. There's no doubt about it. They were very well qualified. All of them had a lot of experience. And Lord Howe, who was the admiral they put in charge, Lord William Howe had been he had led a squadron in the Battle of Quiberon Bay in the 7 Years' War, which was a melee. It wasn't an orderly battle where they have lined ships in the line, so to speak. It was in the the confines of the bay, and it was just a melee. And Admiral Howe, rather, had done very well. He performed admirably as an admiral. His brother, William Howe, was an experienced leader. He had fought in numerous battles of the 7 Years' War and the French and Indian War. He was very experienced. The other man, General John Burgoyne, had been with Jeffrey Amherst when he took Fortress Louisburg in the French and Indian War, which was at the top of Cape Breton, in the northern part of Nova Scotia. He had also been with Wolfe when Wolfe took Quebec City. Burgoyne had actually led the first troops to get up on the Plains of Abraham in the battle for Quebec. Very experienced leaders. They all arrived in Boston in 1775. Not much was taking place at that time. The British were soon driven out of Boston, as we know, but that's not in the scope of the program today. However, Admiral Howe was in charge of taking New York City, the naval part of it. His brother was in charge, the general was in charge of the troops. They had a very large squadron of ships, many troops. They landed in Staten Island. They then proceeded into Brooklyn. And they landed in Staten Island in July. They started campaigning of August 1776. I'm sorry, yeah, 76. They thought they had George Washington trapped in Brooklyn. But Washington, with a good luck and skill, managed to escape by boat over to Manhattan Island in the night, covered with fog. There was fog. Very lucky. The wind was in the wrong direction. That kept the British ships from trapping him in Brooklyn by coming up the East River. They will How will then?
Does that help with your notes, Charlie?
Yeah, now I can see. Excuse me. Allergies when I talk a lot.
Have a cinnamon one. I have a cinnamon one.
I got it.
Okay.
Pardon me. Yeah, I got it. Okay. Anyway, anyway, the Howe brothers were best they had as an admiral and as the general. Their brother, George Howe, was a major general, and he was killed in the assault during the French and Indian War, the assault on Fort Carillon, which the British took, and they renamed Fort Ticonderoga. Fort Ticonderoga was of the design of King Louis XIV's military engineer, Vauban, the Marquis of Vauban. It's the star-shaped fort. Well worth a visit, not far from here. So the House were a long-time military family in Britain. Should talk about Guy Carleton a little bit. Guy Carleton was also a military man with much experience in Europe during the 7 Years' War. He was Governor General of Canada, French Canada, or rather, I mean, British Canada, the British Quebec, that was known at that time. And he had a long military successful history. He was a cautious general, as was Howe. But anyway, going back to the campaign in New York City in August and September of 1776, Howe will pursue George Washington into New York. He will drive Washington out of. He will take New York City and drive Washington out of Manhattan up, and he will fight the Battle of White Plains. Washington will then evacuate his troops across the Hudson River into New Jersey, and General Howe will give chase, so to speak. And he is now involved for the rest of the year and the next summer in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. He will pursue Washington and go down with his brother, Admiral Howe, to come up the Delaware River to take Philadelphia. So as far as the Hudson Valley, Howe's out of it. He's after George Washington. 1776, Guy Carleton will attempt an invasion of Lake Champlain, Hudson River. He's going to go down and take Albany. He's confident that he will have no trouble. However, he does have problems. He needs a fleet if he's going to come down Lake Champlain. He has a fleet in the St. Lawrence River Valley, or in the St. Lawrence River. However, if we can look at the map of Lake Champlain, yep, very good. You see, you have the Richelieu River, which flows north into the St. Lawrence. There are rapids in this river. So to get his fleet into Lake Champlain, he spends the summer taking the ships apart, transporting them around the rapids, and reassembling them back in the Lake Champlain. He spends the summer doing this. He even takes a whole frigate apart and reassembles it. Meanwhile, Benedict Arnold is down at the southern end of Lake Champlain, at where Whitehall is today, and he's building a fleet for the colonists. Benedict Arnold's father was in the merchant marine business. He owned a fleet of merchant ships. And Benedict Arnold had captained one of these ships. He was not only a very good land general, but he was also an experienced seaman. And he builds a number of ships at Whitehall. He knows he can never defeat the British fleet that Carleton is putting together. So his goal was not to defeat the British, but to delay them. If he can delay them long enough, winter sets in, ice will be coming, that'll be the end of that. So he's building a fleet, overseeing it down at what's now Whitehall. He decides that he's going to build some smaller boats that are rowed because they'll be more maneuverable. One of them, the Philadelphia, has been dug up pulled out of Lake Champlain and restored, and it's down in the National Military Museum, or the Museum of American History down in Washington, D.C., the Smithsonian. I tried to get a picture of it, but was unsuccessful. But that is the oldest existing ship in the United States Navy. There is a historical marker up in Whitehall stating that this was the birthplace of the American Navy. But the Navy disputes this. They don't quite agree. But anyway, we get the two fleets. Now, Benedict Arnold takes his fleet and he goes up, and you can see Valcour Island up in a little bit above the halfway mark of Lake Champlain. He hides in the Narrows between the west bank of Lake Champlain and Valcour Island. And as Carleton comes down with his fleet, and he has Benedict Arnold with him. Benedict Arnold is, I'm sorry, he has General John Burgoyne with him. General John Burgoyne being second in command. He is ambushed by Benedict Arnold and the American fleet in the Battle of Valcour Island. Practically all the American ships or boats are sunk. However, Benedict Arnold does accomplish his goal. The Battle of Valcour Island was October 13th and 14th, 1776, I'm sorry. And it does delay the British enough that they have to abandon their campaign till the following year. Because winter comes early in the North Country. And then troops were moving by foot, so it's slow. You need time. They simply ran out of time. So that brings us to the summer of 1777. That winter, Burgoyne returns to England. He goes to Lord George Germain and Lord North, and he presents this plan that he is going to come down Lake Champlain to the Hudson River and take Albany. Barry St. Ledger is going to land in Oswego and come down the Mohawk River to Albany. And Howe will come up the Hudson River with three-pronged assault that will split the Hudson River Lake Champlain corridor. The three armies will meet in Albany. He sells this to Lord North and to George Germain and the king. Burgoyne was very persuasive. He has a theatrical interest. He actually writes plays. And he sells this plan. However, he doesn't get all the troops he needs. He expects to get about 3,000 Canadian militia. He gets about 30 troops. He expects to get a lot of Indians. He gets a small group of Indians. And he gets quite a lot fewer British regulars than he requested. And he has about 8,000 troops from Brunswick, the hirelings, like the Hessians, but these troops were German troops from Brunswick under the command of General Riesling. So this very large party comes down Lake Champlain. He establishes fort, Crown Point, which had been a fort. He takes Fort Ticonderoga rather easily from the colonials. But then when he reaches the southern end of Lake Champlain, the going gets rough. He decides to advance to the Hudson River by foot. He meets a lot of resistance, ambush type stuff, harassment. Burgoyne also has about 5,000 civilian camp followers with him. These are often wives of the troops who serve as cooks and laundresses. So he's got a very still large contingent. And while he's on the lake, logistics are easy. He's easy to get supplies. They load boats that come down. But when he hits the land, it's a different story. This is wilderness. It's not farm area up there at this time. So he ends up having to take his boats, his flat bottom barges, the boat two, and having the horses pull them. There's no food available up there. All of it has to come down the lake. When they see advances on land, the troops, the colonials fall trees, what's militarily called an abatis. They drop trees down with the branches in the direction of the army that's advancing. So they have to clear those out of the way. They lure Burgoyne further and further and further from his base of supplies. Burgoyne said after the war that for every hour he spent thinking about tactics, he had to spend 20 thinking about how he was going to feed his army. He sends a group, about 1,000 of these Brunswick troops under Colonel Baum, to Bennington, Vermont, in search of supplies. But more and more militia troops and Continental regulars have been coming into the area. The very skilled logistical person, if you will, is Philip Schuyler, General Schuyler, who never sees a battlefield, but he assembles troops, supplies, and he gets militia coming in from Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New York. And Burgoyne's 8,000 troops end up facing about 15,000 colonials. So anyway, Baum gets to Bennington, There are no supplies available. He then is outnumbered by about 2,000 to 4,000 colonial militias under the command of John Stark. Burgoyne then sends in a dragoon regiment of Brunswick troops. Dragoons are cavalry, but they don't have any horses because the horses have all been pulling these boats and not having much fodder. They're in bad shape. Stark defeats these German troops from Brunswick in the Battle of Bennington. That takes place in August 16th. So Burgoyne, no supplies. He has to put his troops on very strict rationing. Many of the troops are sick. Many of them desert. He's in bad shape, but he just won't admit defeat. He keeps going. He will attempt to take high ground overlooking Bemis. And the Battle of Freeman's Farm takes place September 19th. Now, if we could look at the map of, I think, well, let's, there's a map of Bennington there. You can go to that. Yeah. And that's bomb. You can see he's completely surrounded by Stark, defeated. And now let's go to Freeman's Farm. We got Freeman's Farm on there. Okay, yeah, that's good. That's I don't know that I have Freeman's Farm. Oh, that's Bemis. Yeah, that's good. All right, that because that leads in. It's all part of the same. So anyway, Burgoyne is unable to take Bemis Heights. So he then, the Battle of Freeman's, Bemis takes place October 7th. And he loses a lot of troops, both in the battles of Freeman's Farm and Bemis Heights. And he's just stuck in nowhere with not many provisions. Meanwhile, now we got to go to the Mohawk Valley, the map on Mohawk Valley. Barry St. Ledger, who is supposed to come. He comes down from Fort Ontario, down the Oswego River into Lake Oneida, and he lays siege to Fort Stanwix. He's very much surprised at Fort Stanwix. His intelligence has told him that the fort is run down and not very well defended. The fact is the fort's in very good shape and it's full of troops, well defended. So he lays siege to Fort Stanwix. Can we see Fort Stanwix? The picture of Fort Stan, there it is. There's Fort Stanwix. It has been recreated or restored. And it's in Rome, New York. It's staffed by the National Park Service. So you can go tour the fort. It's well worthwhile. It's right in the city of Rome. So anyway, Barry St. Ledger will lay siege to Fort Stanwix. And now if we can go back to the map of Mohawk Valley. Meanwhile, the Mohawk Valley is known as Tryon County. Tryon County was named for Governor Tryon, who was the royal governor of New York at the time the revolution begins. Tryon has removed himself to New York City. Well, he was always there. That was the capital of colonial New York. But anyway, the Tryon County Militia, approximately 800 men strong, is advancing up the Mohawk River to relieve the siege of Fort Stanwix. At Oriskany, short, just a day's march from Fort Stanwix. Joseph Brent, whom we got a picture of, and General William Johnson will stage an ambush at Oriskany of the 800-man Tryon County Militia under General Herkimer. And we got a picture of the battle with Herkimer, who was wounded in the knee. But he gets his troops organized two by two, with one man loading and one man shooting. And while it's a real bloody mayhem battle, approximately half the 800 Tryon County Militia are casualties. Herkimer is shot in the knee. He has an inexperienced doctor after the battle amputate his leg, and he bleeds to death during the operation. But anyway, the militia is still left in command of the field. The Indians and Tories are forced to retreat. They have a number of about 600. The Indians and then the troops from the fort will come out and they will plunder the encampment of the British troops. The Indians all are fed up. They've had enough. They leave. Barry St. Ledger has no choice but to retrace his steps back up across Oneida Lake, back up the Oswego River, and evacuates back to Canada. No aid there for Burgoyne. Now, Howe and most of the troops is that pursuing George Washington. He will, however, send General Clinton with about 4,000 troops up the Hudson River with naval support. He will take Fort Montgomery, which is located now just above the Bear Mountain Bridge. There is a chain across the Hudson River, not the one at West Point. This is an earlier chain that's not as heavy. To be able to cut that chain so that the ships can proceed up. Clinton will then send General Vaughan with 2,000 troops further up the Hudson River. He gets up, he destroys the city of Kingston on October 16th, burns most of it. He then proceeds north up the Hudson River. And as he goes north of Kingston, there are more and more militia troops on both sides of the river. He feels, however, he can go up and still relieve Burgoyne, who by this point has already surrendered. Meanwhile, Clinton gets orders from Howe that he is to evacuate the Hudson River Valley and come down and help him take Philadelphia. Clinton is not very happy about this. Even after the war, he says, I lost my opportunity. I could have defeated, we could have defeated, met Burgoyne and defeated the colonials. However, with the number of troops he had and the number of troops that were up above Albany, he would have also run into the same disaster that Burgoyne did. Just a little bit more about the Saratoga battle, which is Freeman's Farm and Bemis Heights. Horatio Gates is the general in charge. He doesn't like being on a battlefield, which is perhaps he should have chosen another line of work. He directs the battle from a house back way behind the lines. He has an argument with Benedict Arnold and restricts him from the battlefield. However, as the battle is raging, Benedict Arnold disobeys the order and he returns to the battlefield, rallies the troops, and helps to defeat Burgoyne. He is wounded in the foot. Because he's a traitor, they can't have a statue up there for all the good he did at Saratoga. So they put a statue of his boot. So anyway, Burgoyne is surrenders. He is promised the honors of war, which was where he could march off the battlefield with his weapons, and he's paroled. He can return to England with his troops and never fight again. However, Governor Clinton of New York and the Continental Congress, they disagree with this decision, and Burgoyne and his troops are sent to Virginia as prisoners of war. Now, what are the results of this? Obviously, the Hudson Lake Champlain corridor wasn't the easy bullet that Lord Germain and Burgoyne thought. The campaign was poorly coordinated. At no point is there any record of a written order from either Lord North or Lord Germain instructing Howe to come up the Hudson River. Howe never did get a definitive order to go up the Hudson River. Burgoyne certainly, as did all of the planners, underestimate the number of revolutionaries. They thought there was a much greater number of the population that was loyal. This was not true. When I went to school, they talked about 1/3 didn't care, 1/3 were loyalists, and 1/3 were revolutionaries. This is cannot be the case. While New York City and they were pretty much loyalists down there, the majority. When you got up above the Hudson Highlands and the Mohawk Valley, this was not so, and certainly not in New England. I mean, the loyalists were rapidly driven out or imprisoned in New England and upstate New York. Many escaped to Canada. Repercussions. Saratoga encouraged France to enter the war. Unlike the War of the Spanish Succession in the early 1700s, the War of Austrian succession in the 1740s, and the French and Indian War, 1757 to 64. France had no commitment or war going on in Europe at this time. She could concentrate on the naval war, and and Britain, having accumulated so much debt, had drastically cut the Navy, the number of ships. So that when France got into the war, Britain did not have enough ships to cover the whole globe like they did in the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, which was fought in the Philippines, Africa, India, the Caribbean, and the Philippines. They just didn't have enough ships. They had to prioritize. And in this they felt that the Sugar Islands in the Caribbean were of more value to them than the 13 colonies. So they committed most of their Navy to that area. They pulled 5,000 troops out of New York City from General Clinton at the time. General Clinton replaced General Howe, much to Clinton's chagrin. These troops were sent down to the Caribbean, and all this enabled us to win our independence. So there were the Saratoga was a very important battle. I mean that is the main. And Britain changed their strategy. Instead of trying to take the Hudson River Champlain corridor, decided they'd campaign in the south. They thought there were many more loyalists down there, which proved not to be the case. And we mentioned Horatio Gates, who did not like to be on a battlefield. He should probably have chosen another vocation. He was sent south to fight Cornwallis. And I believe it was at the Battle of Cowpens. He was on the field and deserted his troops and ran for his life, rode off as fast as he could go, and didn't stop till he got quite a ways up north. That was the end of his career, military career. So, if there are any questions, I will